So here we are back with our class, and we are going to make like a reorganization of everything we have said so far. So the first thing is that you must have noticed that Emily Dickinson wears or uses the lyrical lie in different ways. So this is one, it is said that it has a protean quality. What do we mean by a protean quality? That the lyrical lie is not always the same, that it changes from poem to poem. So sometimes it is very daring, in other poems she defies the world, in other poems she is very humble, in other poems she has a more romantic streak, okay? So this lyrical lie will assume different forms depending on the subject or the topic that Emily Dickinson is discussing. As we said before also, just for you to remember, the poem always exists at the moment of its composition or at the moment of its enunciation. And one of the marks of that, as I said before, is precisely the use of dashes. Remember that. And of course, all those dashes, they confirm to the poem like a hesitant tone. So when you read the poem, the feeling that you have is that you can hear the person thinking, that you can hear Emily Dickinson thinking, okay? And at the same time, for the readers, many times the use of those dashes make the reading of the poems more difficult, okay? So as it's written there in the slide, it hinders fluent reading. It makes fluent reading very difficult. But in fact, these poems are not to be read fluently, but these poems are to be read also in a very thoughtful manner. Of course, the poems are very retrospective. What do we mean by retrospective? Many times, when you read the poems by Emily Dickinson, as for example the poem on possibility, when you start reading it, she says, I dwell in possibility, you start thinking, what is she talking about? What does she mean to dwell in possibility? Because she's not identifying that she's talking about poetry. Only when she establishes the comparison with fiction or with prose, you realize that she's actually talking about poetry. So this means that the poem is self-referential. It is as if she were writing the poem for herself, not for the others. As when we are thinking and we are building our thoughts, we don't need to explain to ourselves why we are thinking what we are thinking. So this is exactly what happens in the poems. And it is because of that many times it's difficult to understand, because we don't know actually what Emily Dickinson is referring to. And many times, and this is another interesting characteristic, the referent of a poem you will find in another poem. That is to say, to understand one of the poems by Dickinson, you have to read another poem, and then you will see that they start making sense. And, well, this is just the last idea that we discussed in the previous blog, the previous part of the class. It is that Dickinson depicts the movements of the mind, okay? And precisely those dashes move or show or precisely how she's moving from one thought to the other. Well, just to show you that her poem is a poem of exploration, we are going to work on a very short one, which is poem 832. And it begins like this. She says, Soto, explore thyself. Therein thyself shall find the undiscovered continent. No settler had the mind. So when you read this poem for the first time, it looks very difficult, because she uses a number of terms like thyself, therein, shalt, okay, that are Old English. These are terms that maybe she took from the Bible, or she took from classical literature, maybe from Shakespeare, maybe from the Romantic poets. But if you read in another relational manner, okay, you will see that the poem makes sense immediately. So, for example, if you start with Soto, who was Soto? Soto was an explorer in the 18th century, okay? So this comes to show that, in a way, Emily Dickinson, she was connected to the outside world. And then immediately, this form of the explorer that she is evoking will be related to another word in the third line, which is the undiscovered continent. So if you think about the undiscovered continent, once again you have this idea of the conqueror, of the travelers going to different worlds, especially if you think about the 15th century, the discovery of America, or the discovery of different territories. And then, if you go to the last verse, she will say, no settler had the mind. And the word settler is referring to the different people that colonized different parts of the world or settled down in different parts of the world, like America. So she's talking about this undiscovered continent. Only that the undiscovered continent is not a geographical region, but the undiscovered continent, as you can see in the last verse or in the last line, is precisely the mind. This is why I said before that Emily Dickinson's poetry is a poetry of intellectual exploration, or a heuristic poetry. So let's read it all together. Soto, she says, explore thyself. Thyself means yourself. So instead of going out and exploring the world, explore yourself, what is there inside you, which is precisely what she does through her poems. Therein thou shalt find, and she says, there, in yourself, you will find the undiscovered continent. So she's saying something very beautiful, that what it is there to be discovered is already here inside us. And she says, no settler had the mind, meaning that there are no colonizers in the mind, that the mind is like a kind of free territory, okay, where you can find yourself. Isn't it a very beautiful poem? Well, let's stop a little bit with the analysis of the poems, and let's reflect a little bit about the characteristics of these poems that we have seen so far. You can see that the poems have an opening, a discussion, the middle part of the poem, and the ending. And in the openings, many times she starts with a statement, that is to say a declaration. Many other times she starts with a definition, okay? Many other times she starts with some evocation or invocation to some person, okay? Many times she starts the poem as if she were talking to another person. So she will use different sorts of beginnings, and you will see that many times these sorts of beginnings, they are taken from other genres, like for example the biblical language, or many times the poems have the shape as if they were nursery rhymes, that is to say the songs sung to children, and many times they even look like cooking recipes. Then in the middle of the poem, there will always be a questioning of that first statement or that first definition, okay, that first affirmation, and she will conjecture, meaning she will start thinking, she will start opposing or putting in counterpoint different ideas, and she will do that through a series of metaphors. And finally, she will come to the ending of the poem that, as we said before, many times it ends in an open note. Okay? So just for you to see it more clearly, the opening lines can be a definition, a declaration, an observation, an element of surprise, an irreverent affirmation. For example, when she says, Soto, explore thyself, okay? It can start in medias res. Do you remember medias res from the other literature classes? Medias res refers to those narratives that when you enter the narrative, when the narrative begins, you have the feeling that the narrative had started before. Okay? As for example, when she says, of course I prayed, okay? Of course I prayed, as if she were answering a comment made by another person. And many times she can start with a humorous or a very irreverent comment. In the middle lines, as I said before, she generally has a sequence of metaphors. Many times this sequence of metaphors is hard to understand because she uses different figures of speech, but she never, or she doesn't identify the referent of those metaphors. And then the closing lines that can be open lines. She can finish in a very abrupt manner. Many times the endings are very anticlimactic because if you follow you're following the poem and you are expecting one ending and she finishes the poem in a completely different note. Many times she finishes with a rhetorical question. After everything she has said, she goes on with the same doubts, okay, that she had at the beginning, and instead of finishing with an answer, she finishes with a rhetorical question. And many times she finishes the poem as if she were addressing a person. Well, let's see exactly how all these elements I have just mentioned work in one of her more beautiful poems, which is poem 632. So she starts saying, look at what she says. The brain is wider than the sky. For put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease and you beside. So she starts with a declaration or with a statement, and she's comparing the brain to the sky. And she's saying that the brain is much bigger than the sky. So you see that this poem, in a way, is connected to the other poem of Soto, Explore Thyself, when she talks about the mind as the undiscovered continent. And then she says, for put them side by side, on the one hand the brain, on the other hand the sky, the one the other will contain, meaning the brain, which is so big, so infinite, will contain the sky with ease, very easily, no problem, with ease, and you beside. So she's putting the other person, okay, inside this grandeur of the brain. And then she goes on with this analogy in order to define the power of the brain. The brain is deeper than the sea. For hold them, blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges, buckets do. Very beautifully, she's comparing the brain to the sea. And she's comparing them in terms of the color of the sea. You see? You compare the blue of one to the blue of the other. Isn't it beautiful? And then she says that the brain, the sea will absorb, and she uses a very domestic image, as sponges, buckets do. Meaning in the same way that sponges can absorb different and many buckets of water. And then she goes on, look, and this is the most irreverent of all. The brain is just the weight of God. For heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, a syllable from sound. So she's saying that the brain is as heavy as God. Okay, so here she is contrasting two ways of understanding the world of belief and the word of reason. And again, as I said at the beginning of the class, she is transgressing the realm of the woman. Women lived within the field of belief, the field of God, the field of the house. And she's entering here in a very irreverent manner in the world of the mind, in the world of the brain, in the world of intellect. And what she's trying to say is that reason things out, or the world of the intellect, is more powerful than the world of God. And then she says, for heft them, pound for pound, meaning measure them, one against the other. In this case, when she says pound, she refers to weight, okay, it's a measure of weight. And they will differ, if they do, again, this irreverent thing, so the brain will be different from God, if eventually it is different, as syllable from sound. Meaning, how can you separate syllable from sound? They are inseparable. They cannot be told apart. This is exactly what happens between the brain and God. It is as if she were saying that God is in the brain. However, when she finishes the poem, she does it with a dash. As we said before, it means that this is an open ending, that she has not said the last word, that she will go back on the same topic, and maybe the next time she goes back on the same topic, she will be worshiping God. Well, this is maybe a little bit of a concept to understand. And the idea is of the ultimate signified. To understand the concept of the ultimate signified, so perhaps you have to go back to de Saussure and to Bakhtin, and to the relationship between sign, the signifier, and the signified. So, for Bakhtin, the signifier and the signified are never just one, or the relationship between the signifier and the signified will depend on the context in which the sign is enunciated. Just to give you a very simple example, if you think of a chair in our world, you think of an element made of wood with 4 legs, yes or no? But if you think of a chair, for example, or a place to sit in India, you will think of a little rug that you put on the floor. So the concept of sitting is the same, but the element to sit is different. So it means that there is not just one last or ultimate signified, okay, for the signifier chair. Well, apparently something of the sort also happens in Emily Dickinson's poems. Because, as I said before, so whenever she's working with these concepts or ideas and she's treating them from a different perspective in different poems, it is as if every one of those poems were presenting the signifier that she's discussing in a different light. And as each one of the poems is open at the end, it means that there is not an ultimate signified. There will always be another idea that will modify the previous ones. And in this sense, again, she was very much ahead of her own times, because she was not working in absolute terms or with the idea of absolute truth, but she was working with the concept of cultural relativity, or with the idea that many times thoughts, ideas, beliefs can be understood differently in different contexts. And in order to work with this idea of the signified, or in order to play with this idea of the signified, Emily Dickinson played with different sorts of metaphors. Or, in other words, she articulated these different signifieds through different signifiers, the signifiers being the different metaphors that she used. Well, this is poem 320. This is one of the most famous poems by Emily Dickinson. And once again, this is a poem, a meta-literary poem on the art of composition. So she says, "We play at paste till qualified for pearl, then drop the paste and deem ourselves a fool." So remember what we said when we analyzed the first poem about the use of capital letters? Immediately she's establishing a contrast between the words paste and pearl. And she says that when we start playing, whatever play means, writing poems, working, whatever we do, we start with something very basic, like paste. And in order to understand what paste she's referring to, we would have to go to a dictionary and look for all the meanings of the word paste. But what she's trying to say is that we always start in a simple manner until we are qualified for more sophisticated things. So she says that we start with the paste, then we pass on to pearl, the sophistication of pearl, then drop the paste and deem ourselves a fool. You know, it is more or less as, for example, when one day we go back to the notes or to our notebooks, the notebooks we had in high school or we had in elementary school, and we see there the things that we used to write, and we say, look at the things I used to write, or how simply I used to think. You understand? So you say, how could I have written that? How could I have thought that? Okay? So this is what she means when she says that we consider ourselves full. And then she goes on. Then the shapes, though, were similar, and our hands learned gem tactics, practicing sans. So she realizes that in spite of working with a more simple material or a more sophisticated material, the shapes of whatever we created were similar, okay? And that in order to produce gems or pearls, we started practicing with something more simple as sand. What is interesting about this poem that I have just discussed with you, and that I said that it could be understood as if it were a meta-literary poem, is that it can refer to the way the poet learns to write. At the beginning, the poet learns to write with paste or with very simple ideas or very simple rhetorical devices until he or she learns to work with more sophisticated ideas or more sophisticated devices. But in spite of the fact that later poems can become more sophisticated, both poems, the simple ones, the complex one, they have a similar shape, and the value of those simple poems is that they taught us how to write more sophisticated things. You can imagine that what I am saying is just an interpretation of the poem, because at no point does Emily Dickinson identify what she means by paste. But we can give her this reference through reading the other poems that she wrote. I hope that all of you will become interested in Emily Dickinson, and you will try to read some anthology by the poet. And just to tell you that there are wonderful and very beautiful translations of Emily Dickinson's poems into Portuguese. This is just a bibliography that I put, okay, at the end of the class in case you want to broaden, okay, your knowledge on Emily Dickinson. So I hope that you enjoyed this class, and that you will take advantage from it, and I hope to see you soon in another class on poetry by another poet who writes in English. Thank you.